Since September 8th in this church, we have been reading from the Old Testament. We started in Genesis 1 all the way back into September 8th because we follow the narrative lectionary, which is a schedule of Bible readings that tries to give us a general broad sweep of the narrative arc of the Bible. And so in the fall, you go work through the Old Testament. And this is the last Sunday of the Old Testament. We made it. Good job. Congratulations. Next Sunday, we start with the Gospel of Luke, and we'll be in the New Testament all the way through Easter. So today, I want to do a little bit of a recap of this narrative arc of the Old Testament, and it's appropriate that we're reading from this passage in Jeremiah to do that, because this passage from Jeremiah uses covenant language. Jeremiah is saying that the voice of God is saying, I'm going to make a new covenant with the people. And we can organize the entire story of the Old Testament according to this idea that God makes promises to people and expects promises back. This covenant theology is what it's called. In fact, we could say that the general story of the Old Testament is God's attempt to be in relationship with humanity through making promises and asking for promises back, with pretty mixed results the entire way. It almost ends up feeling like some trial and error. So let's start with this recap in Genesis 1, where God created the world, the plants and the animals and the people. A friend of mine who's a biblical scholar, Dr. Robert Williamson, has said that in creating the world, what God really wanted was a garden. That's what God wanted. God wanted a garden. But to have a garden, God felt like they needed gardeners. And so God created people in order to be the gardeners of this garden. But the gardeners didn't act like God had hoped. They misbehaved. They were extremely troublesome gardeners. They multiplied very quickly. And the worst thing, the thing that really bothered God the most about these gardeners, is they were extremely violent. They were killing the animals. They were killing each other. Sometimes they killed people in their own families. They killed people on a massive scale. And because of this violence, we are told that God decided they were going to start over. They're going to start the whole project over. And they're going to pick one person, Noah and his family, and then kill everybody else with a flood, which, if you're trying not to be violent, is not the most, it's a little bit of a hypocritical thing to do. But that's what God does. God's like, all right, everybody's gone except Noah. And immediately afterwards, God felt really bad about it. It's like, oh, that didn't feel good at all. I thought that would feel better. And so God, after the flood, makes the first covenant with the people, the first promise. And that promise is, I will never again destroy all living things with a flood, which is kind of a weird little caveat to put on the end of that thing. But anyway, with a flood. So we already are seeing now that there's an evolution happening, that God is trying to be in relationship with people, but that relationship is not static. It's going to be changing and evolving over time. But God is going to try to stick with the people. Unfortunately, starting over with Noah didn't solve anything, not so much because of people this time, but because of God. Because the people at this time did not get violent right away. The story that comes after the flood is the Tower of Babel. And so the people are like, hey, maybe violence isn't working. Let's cooperate instead. And maybe if we cooperate, we can do great things. And they start to build this great tower to heaven. But sadly, God is not comfortable with that either. So God's kind of problematic in this story sometimes. So God doesn't want too much violence, but God doesn't want too much cooperation either. So God decides to put a stop to the building of the tower, knocks down the tower, makes everybody speak different languages, and then scatters them across the earth. So God says, all right, here's a new strategy. And God decides to pick one family to make a special covenant with. And instead of working with all humanity as a whole, God's going to work with one family in particular. And so God chooses Abraham and Sarah, and God makes what's known as the Abrahamic covenant. And in this one, God says, all right, I'm going to be faithful to this one family. I can't work this out with all of humanity. Maybe I can work it out with one group of people. Now, we can read this as that God made a chosen people here. I tend to think of it more as this was another evolution of people's understanding of God, that maybe God can have a personal relationship with us and not just, a God and humanity relationship. So this is one example of what a personal relationship with God would look like with this one family. And so that was going okay until, through a complicated series of events, the descendants of Abraham and Sarah ended up enslaved in Egypt. And it's interesting that the Bible kind of suggests that God kind of forgot about them for a little while, which it doesn't explain, it just says that happened. But when they cried out from slavery, God heard them. So that's where we pick up in the book of Exodus. That the people are enslaved, they're in misery, and they cry out to God for help, and God hears them, and God liberates them, which reveals a character of God that we will see throughout the Old Testament that was in our reading today, that God is fundamentally a liberator. The work of God in the world is to liberate the oppressed. And we heard it in Jeremiah today. I was the one who took you out of Egypt. I was the one who liberated you. Upon their liberation from slavery, God makes another covenant with the people. This time, it's with the 10 Commandments and the Torah. So God says, hey, no more unconditional covenants. Now it's going to be a two-way street. Maybe that's the solution. And so the 10 Commandments and about 600 other laws, God says, if you do these things, then we're going to be good. We're going to be able to have a good relationship. And the people say, yes, we will do it. We will follow all those rules. And then like 10 minutes later, they're like, let's break all the rules. So and so you can see that we're starting to see that this big narrative is like God's trying to figure out, can I even work with these people? Is this gonna work out? But God hangs in there and sticks with them through the desert wandering to the promised land. And the people then in the promised land demand a human king because they don't have enough faith in God to be their king. And God is God's feelings are kind of hurt about that, but God hangs in there with them and lets them select a king, and God selects David and makes another covenant. This is called the Davidic covenant. And this time it's a covenant with a leader, which is interesting. So God's covenant here is like, maybe I need to work with the leaders. And so if the leaders will be righteous, if the leaders will have a reverence of me, if the leaders will protect the vulnerable and be good leaders, then we can work this thing out. But that doesn't work out either. And the leaders do not behave like they should. From here, two things happen. The northern kingdom of Israel secedes, splits off from the southern kingdom, and they're kind of doing their own thing, and then they are conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and they disappear from history. The southern kingdom, the Davidic kingdom, doesn't last much longer, actually. Several generations after David, 8 or 9 maybe, the southern kingdom falls to the Babylonian Empire, and all the leaders of the southern kingdom are taken into exile in Babylon. Now, you might think that would be the end of the story, but what happened is that those leaders, the educated, the elite that were taken into captivity in Babylon, started writing the Bible. So there were a number of different texts that they had, but we think that in the Babylonian exile is when the Old Testament as we have it was finally put together in sort of a form that we know today. And so the people in exile started to try to make sense of this whole long history of their people. And they interpreted the exile as a punishment. They said, well, God must be punishing us for our faithlessness and for the way that we've been treating each other and acting. And you might think that they had lost all hope at that point, but they didn't. They said they believed that God would still be faithful to them and restore them. And remarkably, that happened. The Babylonian Empire is conquered by the Persian Empire, who had a policy of repatriating the Babylonian captives. And so God sent the Hebrew people, the Israelite leaders, back to Jerusalem to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And that was seen and interpreted as a forgiveness, a grace, that God is forgiving the people after their punishment. They no longer have a Davidic king, but they believe that God will provide one day. God will provide an anointed one or a Messiah. So that's sort of the big arc of the Old Testament. And I want to be clear that this is not a literal description of God, right? We can look at this and say, this is a terrible depiction of a God of love or a universal God or a divine mystery, it's not intended to be perfect or literal. It's intended to be a caricature. It's intended to be a story, giving God a human character so that we can get our hands around what a relationship with God might look like. In our passage today from Jeremiah, the prophet has a vision of a new attempt by God to have a happy, peaceful relationship with people. And this time, God has the idea that God's going to change our hearts, that God's going to write the law on people's hearts, that everyone's just going to know what's right. If we think about this in the larger context of our story, here God is acknowledging that people just aren't going to change on their own. That after multiple attempts God has made to be in a relationship with people, finally God's like, hey, maybe it's me. Maybe I have to take responsibility for this people that I've created, and I have to change them. I have to fix them. Comedian Bill Burr, who is very problematic and offensive in many ways, but newsflash, I like comedians like that. For the most part. I mean, they can go too far. But Bill Burr says that he challenges the idea that God should ever judge people. And he says that when he dies, if he's standing before God in judgment, he's going to push back and he's going to say, how can you judge me? You made me. All of this anger, all of these bad ideas, and this is your work. How can you what did you expect to happen if you were going to put all this stuff in me? And I think he's got a point, and I think that God is speaking that same sentiment through Jeremiah here. Like, yeah, there's something wrong with these people. Maybe I need to be the one to change it. I think it's like people need a software update. Like we're version 1.0 and we have a bunch of bugs in the system, and God's going to upload some patches, all right? Like when you get an update on your phone and you read about what's going to be in the update before you do it, and it says bug fixes and performance improvements. It's like that's what God's saying here. God's like, I need to rewrite the code in these people, and so we're going to fix the software. So the software is going to be like decreasing our tendency toward violence. That's going to be in the patch. Increasing our willingness to help the vulnerable. Decreasing our anxiety about the future. Increasing our faith, improving our use of turn signals, less awkwardness on elevators, right? Reading the push-pull sign before you try, So bug fixes and performance improvements. And some of those fixes are going to be less important than others, but in general, what's envisioned here is like humanity's 6.0. The question that's left unanswered in Jeremiah's vision is when? When is this going to happen? Is this tomorrow? Is this in a year? Is this in 100 years? When is this update happening? It's like waiting for Apple to announce their newest products. Like when is it going to happen? And it doesn't say. He never says that. He never says when this vision of humanity being changed and transformed is actually going to happen. But I've got some good news for you. Beta testing has begun. You can sign up for an early update. You can email the company and say, hey, I know you're going to be rolling out this update for all of humanity at some point. Can I be part of the beta test? I want to try the update right away. Or in Jeremiah's language, we invite God to write the law on our hearts today. We invite God to put the law within us. We volunteer, or as Isaiah says, we say, here I am, send me. So, I know people are still feeling a lot of anxiety about the upcoming administration. People have a lot of fear about what might be coming. And people are asking and wondering, what can we do? How do we fight back? What's the right thing to do now? And there's good advice out there. And it's the stuff that we've always needed to do. Organize, build relationships with people, build relationships especially with the marginalized, do all of that on a very local level, speak up about injustice, It's all the things that we've always needed to do, we need to keep doing. So yes to all of that. And one more thing that you might not hear out there in the world, but I think we need to talk about it here in church, is we need to work on ourselves. We need to cultivate and grow our own virtues. We need to be better people. Unless we're intentionally working on ourselves, we're going to carry whatever demons that we have into every endeavor that we try. So unless we address our toxic or harmful or less than ideal parts of our personality or behaviors, whatever fixes we try and come up with in the world are going to carry with them toxicity and harmfulness and be less than ideal. And so Jeremiah is asking us in this time, are we willing to ask God for help? Are we willing to ask God to rewrite the programming within us? Are we willing to ask for a change of our hearts? Are we willing to sign up for this beta version of Jeremiah's vision? So here's the activity for Consecration Sunday. In addition to, if you want to bring an offering up or a pledge card, everybody has these green little hearts. And thanks to office manager Tracy, she found these really cool green leaf hearts. So growth, right? It's an idea of growth. And before you start writing, let me give you some instructions. I'm going to invite you to write on it something that you want God to help you improve about yourself in 2025. Or maybe just in the next few months. And folks on Zoom, you can put it in the chat. But be specific. So not just, and there's some pens that if you need pens, the usher's going to come down with them. Be specific. So not just, God, please change my heart. But God, help me be more forgiving. God, help me be more courageous. God, help me be less anxious. God, help me, strike up conversations with strangers. Help me be a better listener. Help me pray and meditate more. Last week, we talked about being more generous. So be specific, and maybe even really specific. You've all probably heard of SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. Time bound, that's what I've heard, yeah. So, God, help me say a kind word to a stranger 3 times a week for a month. If you think about the law, the Torah, it's very specific. And so maybe this law that's going to be on our hearts should be specific too. God, help me confront my uncle about his obnoxious behavior and forgive him before Easter. God, help me do more devotional reading, 5 to 10 minutes a morning through January. God, help me voice my opinion about the political issues twice at Thanksgiving dinner. Oh. Okay, so make it specific. But one more instruction, maybe leave out the names, because the idea is we're going to put these on a whiteboard in the narthex. So maybe not too specific, like, help me with this person sitting next to me, but maybe don't name names. But yeah, something specific, and then you're going to be invited to come forward and place that as an offering during the Consecration Sunday observance. So to wrap this up, what we have in the Bible is a story about the human condition. And that story is actually framed around God's attempts to be in relationship with us, often unsuccessfully. So Jeremiah envisions yet one more attempt, this time in which God rewrites our code. God changes our hearts. God fixes the bugs. But Jeremiah doesn't tell us when this massive change in humanity will take place. So in the meantime, and especially in these times, we can sign up for the beta version. We can ask God to begin writing a new code on our hearts today. We've got a lot of work to do in the coming years, and if we're going to be effective at all the things we need to do, we also need to be working on ourselves just as much as we're trying to fix the world. Amen.